Pesto reflected Denzel Washington's disciplined spirit. His home office was a quiet haven, documents stacked in perfect order, legal notes highlighted with precision, and a crisp navy suit pressed and ready by the door the night before. He wasn't heading to a film set or an activist event that morning. Instead, Denzel had a more personal matter to attend to, an unresolved contract dispute at the Pesto Municipal Court involving a youth center he had funded in memory of his mother. The center had been overbilled for a maintenance contract, and Denzel was determined to set the record straight. He kept his routine simple. Wearing a clean dark jacket over a white t-shirt and jeans, he grabbed a banana and his travel mug of coffee. His black Tesla, a silent nod to his passion for innovation and clean energy, waited in the garage. He often noticed the double takes when people saw a cultural icon like him driving himself alone, unescorted. Traffic in Pesto moved at a snail's pace, but Denzel wasn't worried. He had left early, planning to arrive with enough time to review his documents before the hearing. NPR played in the background, reporting the morning headlines, but Denzel's mind was already racing through the details of the case. He had the original invoice, the revised contract, and a detailed breakdown of discrepancies. Everything was documented and photographed. Suddenly, the car's infotainment system flashed with an incoming call. Michael Reynolds, a longtime political advisor and current director of the Civic Justice Coalition. Denzel's grip on the wheel tightened. Michael rarely called this early unless something serious had come up. "Denzel, sorry to call so early." Michael's voice came through the speaker. "We've had an issue with the administration's Gulf of America initiative. The press is exploding, and I need your help drafting a response. The Gulf of America rebranding effort, a politically charged attempt to rename the Gulf of Mexico, had become a lightning rod in recent weeks." Denzel, known for his balanced voice in national conversations, had been unofficially advising on its communication strategy. "How soon do you need something?" Denzel asked, voice calm. "By noon. I'm sending you the documents now. Can you take a look and call me back?" "I got you," Denzel replied. His tone was professional, though his mind was already shifting gears. He pulled into a parking lot beside a quiet cafe, opened his laptop, tethered it to his phone, and began scanning the talking points. The media's questions were aggressive and the legal implications complex. He began outlining sharp, nuanced responses, aiming to protect not just a policy, but the communities it would affect. Time slipped away. When he finally glanced at his watch, panic struck. It was nearly court time, and the courthouse was still a 10-minute drive away. Denzel quickly called Michael back, shared his preliminary thoughts, and promised a complete brief later that afternoon. Back in traffic, he stayed composed. He prided himself on never being late to a film shoot, a speaking event, or a community commitment. But this time, duty had pulled him in two directions. And as someone who understood the weight of public responsibility, he knew which side had to come first. He pulled into the Pesto Municipal Court parking lot a few minutes behind schedule. Just as he stepped out of the car, his phone buzzed. "Your quick analysis was spot on. Thanks for prioritizing this." Michael Denzel allowed himself a rare smile. At least the delay had meant something. But what Denzel didn't realize, as he climbed the courthouse steps with his folder in hand, was that arriving just a few minutes late would set off a chain of events that would shake a system he hadn't expected to confront that day. Judge Kash Patel's courtroom awaited, a place known more for rigid control than for compassion. Inside, the morning air was cool, the tension palpable. At 48, Kash Patel wore his black robe-like armor. With slicked back hair and a sharp jawline, he exuded a presence that demanded submission more than respect. Over his years behind the bench, he had cultivated a reputation for being quick to judgment and quicker to punish what he viewed as disorder. That morning, he sat high above the courtroom in a leather-backed chair, his nameplate polished, gavel neatly placed, as more than 20 individuals quietly filled the wooden benches. Most were there for minor infractions, expired registrations, contract mix-ups, parking citations. Patel surveyed the room, noting who was dressed appropriately, who looked prepared, nodding only at those who fit his image of order. "All rise," called out Robert Hayes, the aging and respected bailiff. Patel's courtroom was now in session. With mechanical precision, Judge Patel began his routine. dispatching the first few cases like a conveyor belt. To him, punctuality wasn't just a courtesy, it was a loyalty test, a test he believed only certain types of people passed. Then, a creak. The courtroom doors swung open softly a few minutes after proceedings had started. Denzel Washington stepped inside quietly, holding a folder of documents under one arm, doing his best not to disrupt. But his presence did not go unnoticed. Judge Patel paused mid-sentence, his eyes locking onto the latecomer with icy intent. He didn't bother hiding his disdain. "Step forward," he snapped, his voice cold and sharp, cutting across the room like a blade. The current case was instantly cast aside. Denzel walked calmly to the front, every step measured. He carried himself with quiet authority, his back straight, his gaze respectful. He knew this routine. He'd seen it play out in rooms less formal, but no less hostile. Judge Patel glanced at the docket and then back at Denzel, squinting slightly. "You must be Mr. Washington," he said, drawing out the words like a warning, "scheduled for the very start of this session." His tone dripped with theatrical disappointment. "Do you believe your time is more valuable than this court's?" Patel continued, voice rising with every syllable. "Do you think you can just stroll in here at your leisure? Is that how things work in Hollywood or whatever cause you're fronting today?" The room shifted, physically and emotionally. Some people sat up straighter, others exchanged glances. A few who'd arrived late earlier but gone unnoticed now grew uneasy. Just moments ago, a middle-aged banker had slipped in 10 minutes late and been waved through without a word. Denzel stood still at the podium, his hands resting calmly in front of him, his expression unreadable. He made no move to interrupt, no show of protest. He simply observed. Patel, emboldened by the silence, went on. "In this courtroom, we follow rules," he lectured, not even looking at Denzel as he shuffled some papers for show. "This isn't a movie set or a press stunt. This is a court of law. You don't get to make up your own script here." Bailiff Robert Hayes watched from the side, discomfort flickering in his tired eyes. In his 15 years, he'd seen Judge Patel react this way many times, but only with certain people. He didn't need to say it aloud to recognize the pattern. Denzel noticed too. Patel hadn't looked at his documentation, hadn't asked why he was late, hadn't offered the same courtesy others had received. The contempt wasn't about time. It was about who he was, and it wasn't the first time Denzel had been underestimated. "Your Honor, may I explain?" Denzel began, his voice steady, respectful, but unwavering. "You may not," Judge Kash Patel cut him off sharply, raising a hand with exaggerated finality. His tone was firm, not to enforce order, but to shut down any resistance before it even began. "I've heard every excuse in the book, traffic, confusion, personal emergencies. None of that matters here," he declared, raising his gavel in the air as if it alone carried the weight of justice. Around the courtroom, people shifted in their seats. The tension was suddenly tangible. A young woman in a sleek business suit who had slipped in late just before Denzel now sat quietly, untouched and unmentioned. It was clear to everyone watching. Something wasn't right. Patel, oblivious to the perception brewing around him, pressed forward. "This court will not tolerate disrespect for procedure. Perhaps a fine will remind you of the importance of punctuality." But Denzel stood firm at the podium, unmoved, his hands clasped calmly in front of him. His eyes never flinched. This wasn't the first time he had been dismissed, not in Hollywood, not in activism, and not in politics. But this moment felt different. This was a blatant abuse of authority, and it was happening in plain sight. Court clerk Mrs. Margaret Evans, a seasoned woman who had worked under Patel for over a decade, hesitated at her computer. She had typed many rulings without a second thought, but something about this moment felt wrong. Her fingers hovered uneasily over the keyboard as she prepared to log the fine. Judge Patel leaned forward in his high-backed leather chair, as if performing his role before an audience. "Mr. Washington," he said, his voice echoing through the now silent courtroom, "this court hereby finds you in contempt and imposes a $500 fine." A collective shift moved through the room. That was one of the steepest penalties Patel had ever issued for simple lateness. Though he, of course, didn't say that aloud. Denzel didn't move. "Oh, He didn't speak. Instead, he mentally cataloged every word, every expression, every inconsistency. He had trained himself for moments like this. He noticed that Patel's eyes never quite met his, that his voice held the same flavor of arrogance and bias Denzel had encountered for years. From boardrooms to back rooms, from studios to city halls. Mrs. Evans, uneasy now, logged the fine into the system, but not before jotting a discreet note into her private log. Just last week, she recalled, a white male attorney had arrived 20 minutes late and received nothing more than a casual warning. But Judge Patel wasn't done. He was emboldened by Denzel's silence. "Let this serve as a lesson in responsibility," he continued, holding up a paper he wasn't reading from. It was all performance. "This legal system runs on order and respect. Without punctuality, we have chaos." The audience reactions varied. The young woman in the business suit glanced nervously at her watch, remembering how her lateness had passed unnoticed. An older man in the back, a retired postal worker, shook his head slightly. He'd seen this too many times before. Bailiff Robert Hayes maintained his professional stance at the front, but his jaw had tightened. In 15 years, he had silently witnessed this pattern again and again. Today, he knew, would be different. Denzel took a slow, deliberate breath. He had weathered fierce critics, evasive journalists, and political attacks. But this was personal. And yet, it wasn't just about him. He wasn't here just as a defendant anymore. He was about to become a catalyst. But this was different. For Denzel Washington, this wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. He was used to being underestimated, to people seeing his fame before his intellect. But today, the courtroom had become a reflection of something deeper, a broken system. One that didn't just punish lateness, it punished identity. He calmly pulled out his phone and noted the $500 contempt fine, the time, the judge's exact words. Everything, document first, act later. He had learned that long ago. From his bench, Judge Kash Patel leaned in further, voice tightening with condescension. "You will pay this fine before leaving this courthouse today. We wouldn't want you being late for that too, would we?" A few uncomfortable chuckles rose from the gallery, quickly silenced by the sheer tension in the air. Sunlight now poured through the tall windows behind the judge, casting shadows across Denzel's face as he stood at the podium, still collected, but burning with quiet resolve. A more perceptive judge might have sensed what was coming. Patel did not. What he also didn't see was how he just handed Denzel every tool he needed to dismantle the courtroom's illusion of fairness. "Do you understand the fine as I've explained it?" Patel asked, tone smug, expecting submission. Denzel finally spoke, clear and calm. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand completely." Each word was deliberate, controlled, weaponized. Judge Patel nodded, believing he had silenced the man before him. Just another public figure, knocked down a peg. But Denzel wasn't done. As Patel reached for the next file, ready to move on as if nothing had happened, the courtroom shifted. Denzel quietly opened his briefcase and pulled out a leather-bound notebook, pages filled with notes from legal meetings, case studies, and advocacy seminars. The morning light danced across the handwritten margins. Patel looked down. He assumed it was over. He was wrong. "Your Honor," Denzel's voice rang out, not defiant, but composed, powerful. The room froze. "Before we proceed, I need to place something on the record." He held up his notebook, dozens of legal precedents visible. "My name is Denzel Washington, and while I am not a licensed attorney, I've spent years advocating for legal reform, reviewing court practices, and advising policy leaders. I have more than enough legal knowledge to question this court's ruling." The silence was instant. Shock rippled across the courtroom. Patel's face drained of color. The gavel in his hand stopped midair. He was no longer in control. Court clerk Margaret Evans froze over her keyboard, wide-eyed. Bailiff Robert Hayes, so often a silent observer, allowed himself a faint, knowing smile. "I apologize for the delay this morning," Denzel continued, his voice even and respectful. "But I was handling an urgent request regarding a public statement on a federal decree. I have the correspondence, if the court requires it." He tapped his phone gently, The woman in the suit who had gone unnoticed earlier shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The man in the back, the retired local, sat up, eyes locked in admiration. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was history. Patel tried to speak. Mr. Washington, if I had known, my role shouldn't matter, Denzel interrupted calmly. What should matter is fairness, equal treatment, justice. He placed the notebook on the podium, then pulled up his phone again. I've taken detailed notes on the proceedings this morning. I've seen unequal treatment of defendants based on age, reputation, and perceived authority. Patel's face shifted to a pale green. He knew deep down that this man, standing calmly before him, had the credibility and influence to dismantle everything he had built on intimidation and optics. Perhaps we can speak in chambers, Patel muttered, his voice suddenly uncertain. And of course, the fine is dismissed. But Denzel didn't flinch. No, Your Honor, he said, voice heavier now. Dismissing the fine because of who I am would only further highlight the very bias I'm addressing. A murmur moved through the courtroom. People leaned forward. Phones, despite the rules, quietly recorded the moment. Instead, I propose a broader conversation about fairness in this court. Evans resumed typing, faster than ever. Hayes edged slightly forward, sensing the magnitude. This morning, Denzel continued, 7 people entered this courtroom after the session began. Of those, 3 were older professionals, no reprimand. 2 were students, verbal warnings. 2, including myself, received public shaming and financial penalty. He paused. The pattern is not accidental. Patel fumbled with his robe. These are serious accusations. No accusation, Denzel said calmly. Just observation and action. He turned slightly to address the room. As someone committed to reform, I've already shared a preliminary account of today's session with legal reform organizations. We cannot fix what we refuse to see. A young law student in the back furiously scribbled notes. The retired local wiped a tear. What do you propose? Patel asked, his voice no longer booming, just small. Denzel stood tall. 3 immediate steps, Your Honor. He raised one hand. First, I will pay the $500 fine. Not because it's just, but so it remains on record as a documented injustice. He raised another finger. Second, I request a 6-month review of contempt fines issued by this court, broken down by age, race, and occupation. And a third, I urge mandatory bias awareness training for all court personnel, including the bench. Now the silence wasn't stunned. It was electric. Evans captured every word. Hayes nodded faintly. Patel looked like a man unraveling in real time. These suggestions, Patel tried, while well-meaning, seem extreme for tardiness. Denzel didn't blink. What's extreme, Your Honor, he replied, is how small injustices compound into massive barriers, how the bias of one courtroom can ripple into lives, jobs, and futures. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a check. I'll pay the fine now, and my team will follow up with your office by Monday. I'll pay the fine now, Denzel said calmly, pulling out the check and placing it on the podium. And my team will follow up regarding the court records. There was a anger in his voice. No indignation, only the quiet, measured resolve of a man who had spent his life navigating and dismantling injustice from within. The morning sun now filled every corner of the courtroom, casting Patel in stark contrast to the man standing before him. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. The judge, once towering in his seat, now looked like a man exposed. And everyone in that room knew they had witnessed something far greater than a courtroom quarrel. This wasn't just Denzel's personal triumph. It was the unmasking of a systemic failure. And it was just the beginning. By late afternoon, the story had already ignited across New Hampshire's legal and political circles. It began, like so many revolutions do, with a single message. A young law student who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom pulled out her phone and texted her study group. Just saw Denzel Washington take down a judge in court. Unreal, like legally dismantled him. Her friends didn't believe her until the footage began circulating. Quiet recordings from phones in the gallery surfaced. Hashtags like #Judge Patel and #Legal Genius exploded across social media. Meanwhile, in his DC office, Denzel sat at his desk reviewing public response briefs for the Gulf of America policy, but his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. First, it was colleagues from New Hampshire, then national reporters, then civil rights groups. Many had stories of their own, people who had faced Judge Patel's wrath and remained silent for years out of fear or shame. "This isn't just about me," Denzel told his longtime friend and advisor David Parker, who dropped by after seeing the trending news. "If this happens to someone like me, with resources, education, and reach, just imagine what regular folks go through every day." He handed David his phone, showing message after message. Lawyers, politicians, community leaders, even clerks, all with one common theme. Finally, someone stood up. Back in the courthouse break room, Clerk Margaret Evans sat with two staff members. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened a small notebook she had kept hidden for years. "I've been keeping track," she admitted quietly. "Every time something felt off, every time a defendant got treated differently, I logged it." She flipped through the pages. Dates, names, fine amounts, remarks overheard. The room went quiet as they realized the depth of what she had captured. By early evening, the local news caught up. Outside Pesto Municipal Court, Channel 7's Jonathan Lee stood with a microphone in hand. Sources confirmed that actor and activist Denzel Washington was fined $500 this morning by Judge Kash Patel for arriving late. But what unfolded next has sparked a statewide debate on bias in our legal system. The broadcast played snippets from social media posts, including the notebook Denzel had held up. A caption scrolled beneath. "Unexpected legal brilliance shakes court to its core." In his home, Judge Patel sat frozen in front of the TV. His phone had been ringing for hours. Calls from fellow judges, local politicians, the State Judicial Review Board. He had presided over that courtroom for more than a decade. But now, it wasn't just his authority in question, it was his legacy. At the same time, Denzel's office received a call from Emily Carter, a veteran political journalist from New Hampshire. "We've tried exposing these biases before," she said, "but hearing it from someone like you, who lived it firsthand, makes it undeniable. Will you speak at tomorrow's press conference?" Back at the courthouse filing office, staff had already begun pulling Patel's case records. Whispers grew louder. "You seeing this?" one clerk muttered. "Last year alone, defendants under 30 got max fines 3 times more often than those over 50, and that's just what we've seen so far." By nightfall, national news outlets had joined the storm. New Hampshire judge under fire after finding Denzel Washington. Courtroom drama goes viral. Denzel exposes judicial bias. Social media buzzed with stories from people across the country who had faced similar experiences. What was once a single courtroom moment was now a national conversation. That evening, Bailiff Robert Hayes got a call from an old colleague in Concord. "We've all seen stuff like this," he said over the phone. "But this time, someone with power saw it, and they didn't just take it, they turned it into a reckoning." Hayes looked down at his notes from that morning, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe this time, it really will change. Bailiff Robert Hayes had watched scenes like this unfold countless times, powerless to act, bound by protocol. But this time, it was different. Someone had finally stood up, and the system couldn't look away. Late that night, Denzel Washington sat alone in his study, the glow of his laptop reflecting off his face. Hundreds of messages flooded in, some from political leaders, others from activists, law students, even former defendants. All of them carried a common message. "Thank you. You gave us hope." Emails from legal think tanks invited him to speak at reform summits. Civil rights groups wanted him to help document similar cases. Law schools asked him to guest lecture on systemic bias in the judiciary. But Denzel didn't let it become about ego. He saw it for what it was, a moment of clarity for a nation tired of unequal justice. He opened a blank document on his laptop and began outlining a formal report to the New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Committee. This wasn't just about Kash Patel or one morning in one courtroom. This was about all the silent injustices no one had challenged until now. As he typed, his phone buzzed again. A message from a young law student read, "Thank you for showing us we can change the system from within. You've given us hope." 1 week later, the Judicial Conduct Committee launched a formal investigation into Judge Kash Patel. On the 10th floor of the New Hampshire State Justice Building, the conference room buzzed with urgency. Laura Bennett, the committee's lead investigator, stood at the center table. With over 20 years of experience, she had seen plenty, but never a case that escalated this quickly or with this much public attention. Boxes of court records lined the walls. Her team of analysts sifted through thousands of rulings from the last 5 years. "Look at these numbers," Laura said, pointing at her laptop. "In minor contract disputes, defendants under 30 were fined an average of $400. Over 50? Just $120. That's not discretion, that's a pattern." She pushed up her glasses, sighing heavily. And that's just the beginning. A few doors down, Margaret Evans sat quietly in a small interview room, clutching her worn notebook. "I noticed it my first year," she told the investigators, her voice low but firm. "The way Judge Patel spoke to people, it changed depending on who they were. Younger defendants, especially people of color, he didn't even let them finish a sentence." Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through years of handwritten notes, dates, quotes, outcomes. The truth she had buried for over a decade was finally seeing daylight. The investigation widened. Dozens of former defendants, attorneys, and courthouse staff were interviewed. Some were still nervous. Others finally felt safe enough to speak. Bailiff Robert Hayes submitted a handwritten testimony spanning over 15 pages. It documented everything he had observed over his 15 years of service. "Some days I counted how many times Judge Patel interrupted defendants. Young defendants were interrupted 5 times more often than older ones. Some weren't even allowed to explain their situation." Meanwhile, at Denzel's office, the environment had shifted completely. What was once a calm space for reviewing statements had become a hub of testimonies and paperwork. Young advisors arrived with files of their own. Activists dropped off binders filled with decades of ignored complaints. "We need to organize all of this," Denzel told his assistant, eyes scanning the growing pile of evidence. "Every story matters. Every incident counts. This isn't just about one courtroom. It's a system built to ignore people like us. And now we finally have the receipts. This isn't just about one judge," Denzel had told the press. "It's about reshaping how we view justice." And the numbers backed him up. The investigation team uncovered even more disturbing patterns. Young women received the highest average fines. Cases involving defendants under 35 were processed 40% faster, often rushed through without due consideration. Requests for payment plans were denied 3 times more often for younger defendants. Witnesses defending young people were interrupted more frequently, their testimonies marginalized. Judge Kash Patel was summoned for questioning multiple times. Each session peeled back more layers of unconscious bias. At first, he was defensive, but when confronted with the data, undeniable, visual, overwhelming, something in him broke. "I've always prided myself on being fair," he said in one quiet interview, stripped of courtroom bravado. "I didn't realize how deeply my assumptions shaped what I call justice." For the first time, it seemed he understood. And it wasn't just him. The investigation, which had begun as a probe into Patel's courtroom, soon spread across the region. Other judges in the area showed similar discriminatory patterns. The rot ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. By the end of the 3rd week, Laura Bennett and her team delivered a 300-page report to the New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Board. It was meticulous. Pages of data, case studies, personal testimonies, statistical breakdowns. "This report doesn't document isolated incidents," Laura said, placing the thick binder on the long table. "It exposes a systemic culture that has quietly disadvantaged thousands over the years, often without the perpetrators even realizing it." The message was clear. It wasn't just about removing a judge. It was about rebuilding the system. 3 months after Denzel Washington stood in that courtroom, the face of justice in Pesto had begun to shift. Early one morning, the sun streamed through the windows of the courthouse lobby as workers installed a new sign, "Center for Judicial Training and Fairness." Kash Patel no longer sat on the bench. After the committee's findings were made public, He was given a choice: resign or face an open disciplinary hearing. He chose to step down, but in an unexpected twist, he did not disappear in shame. Instead, he accepted an offer to speak at the first judicial bias training session, standing not as a judge, but as an example. "I never saw my own bias," Patel admitted to a room full of fellow judges and clerks. "I thought fairness meant treating everyone the same. I never considered how my upbringing, my assumptions, my unchecked power shaped the way I ruled." His voice had lost its edge. His posture was no longer commanding, but sincere. The room listened, many uncomfortably, a few gratefully. At the back of that room sat Denzel Washington, quietly observing the man he once faced. He hadn't expected this outcome, but he recognized it for what it was: a rare sign of progress. Next to him sat Margaret Evans, now promoted to head a new court monitoring initiative. Her notebook was no longer secret. It had become the blueprint for change. The reforms didn't stop there. A new rule mandated detailed monthly records of all fines, courtroom behavior, and rulings, reviewed by a rotating board of community leaders, legal experts, and activists. Robert Hayes, the veteran bailiff, was appointed to lead a new training academy for courtroom staff. "We're the eyes and ears of the courtroom," he told his first class of trainees. "It's our job to speak up when we see injustice. The days of silence are over." Back in Washington, Denzel stood in his office, now framed by dozens of thank you letters, legal memos, and student essays. But one item sat directly behind his desk: the $500 fine receipt, now in a frame. To him, it wasn't a mark of humiliation. It was a reminder that one stand in one room could echo through halls of power, through systems long left untouched, and spark a movement. The framed $500 fine receipt now hung behind Denzel Washington's desk, not as a mark of shame, but as a symbol of change. Visitors would pause, ask about it, and hear the story of how one morning in a small-town courtroom redefined what accountability could look like. Below the receipt hung a new photo: Denzel, surrounded by a group of diverse law students. He had begun teaching a weekly seminar on ethics and implicit bias at a local university, something he never planned but now saw as essential. "It's not about punishing wrongdoing," he told a reporter during a national interview. "It's about changing how we think about justice. Every person who walks into a courtroom, no matter their age, background, or title, deserves respect." The ripple effect extended far beyond Pesto. Other cities across New Hampshire implemented similar reforms: mandatory bias awareness training for all courtroom staff, regular audits of fines and rulings, community oversight committees, new transparent guidelines for sentencing and contempt charges. Even law schools began to shift. Diversity and judicial equity training became part of the core curriculum, using Denzel's case as a national example. One crisp morning, 3 months after the hearing, Denzel received a handwritten letter. It was from the young law student who had been in the courtroom that day. That moment changed everything. "I've switched my career path. I now focus on social justice law. You showed me that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" She had launched a legal clinic on her campus dedicated to helping students and locals fight discrimination in municipal courts. Meanwhile, back in Pesto, the elderly local man who had quietly watched it all unfold returned to the courthouse. He walked slowly through its halls, eyes taking in every detail: multilingual welcome signs, a help desk offering free legal aid, security staff greeting visitors equally, no matter what they looked like. He turned to a young clerk at the front and said, eyes misting, "I've been coming here for 40 years. This is the first time I felt justice might actually be fair." Just then, Denzel's phone buzzed. It was a message from the New Hampshire Judicial Review Board. They wanted him to lead a statewide commission on court reform. As he read the message, he looked again at the receipt on his wall, remembering that courtroom, the judge, the silence, the tension, and then the decision to speak. A small act had ignited a transformation. In the main lobby of the Pesto courthouse, just beside the security checkpoint, a new bronze plaque was mounted to the wall. It read, "Justice isn't just about the law. It's about how we treat every person who walks through these doors." And beneath it, in engraved lettering, the day Denzel Washington entered this courtroom and changed everything. This story of a judge who underestimated, of a courtroom transformed, of one man's refusal to accept silent injustice, mirrors real challenges in today's justice system. Bias tied to age, race, class, and reputation still exists, not just in courtrooms, but in workplaces, schools, and media. But what this story reminds us is this: you don't need a title to make a difference. You don't need permission to do what's right. You just need to stand up once, clearly, boldly, and the world might just follow. So if you ever find yourself dismissed, underestimated, or silenced, remember Denzel's story. Don't let bias define you. Let your voice reshape the system, one step at a time.